really excited to work our way into this text. And so we've kind of looked already at a lot of different aspects of this, of hope acknowledged. Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, uh, making this declaration in the midst of all kinds of circumstances, all kinds of prophecies of this kingship that's his. Um, and then from there to look on Good Friday at this idea of hope being arrested. And so as we make our way into this, again, I want you to see this is vital for us, not just during this season of Easter, not just during this season of uncertainty, but moment by moment, day by day, over the long haul and over the course of our lives. And so this morning, this idea of hope announced, what do we do with the news that we've seen over the past couple of weeks, working our way through these texts? And it's a very fitting way to end looking at Matthew's gospel after this resurrection account by looking at verses 16 to 20. So 5 very simple verses, 5 very familiar verses, probably 2 very familiar verses. The danger with that is that familiarity sometimes can lead to apathy. Sometimes, not always. Familiarity can lead to complacency. So there's a real danger with a verse like this, a passage like this, a text like this, because we approach it with the mindset, I already know this. And so because of that, because of the familiarity of a text like this, we grow complacent, or we can grow apathetic. So if you've ever flown anywhere, you know the reality of tuning things out. So if you've flown anywhere more than once, you rarely, if ever, listen to the flight attendant. You already know how to buckle a seatbelt. You already know kind of what to look for and where the emergency exits are and all of these kinds of things. Like if the oxygen tank mask or the mask falls, in front of your face, fix yours first before helping, an infant around you, and those kinds of things. And, grab your seat bottom for flotation, which most of the time you're not flying over a lake that would require that anyways. But that's neither here nor there. My point is that very rarely do we tune in to the safety kind of features that the flight attendant is calling us to if we've flown more than once. So familiarity brings about and can lead to complacency or apathy. Don't let that idea impact you this morning with a text like this. So what I want you to see, we'll work our way, very fitting as we finished the Gospel of Matthew, is that Matthew's Gospel begins, and Matthew's point all along in his Gospel is to show that Jesus is the great King. So Matthew 1:1 begins with that very idea. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So it goes right for his kingship. Jesus is the son of David. And he makes the point from the very first words in the gospel all the way through the end of Jesus' kingship, Jesus' authority as the great king. We've seen that as we worked our way through the last 3 sermons together, the last 2 Sundays. So Palm Sunday is that Jesus came in ways that no one expected, to accomplish what no one expected, for people that no one expected, right? So he comes as this great king. Good Friday, again, atoning for our sins, and all of creation recognizing and attesting to the fact that Jesus is the rightful king and heir of all things. So on Good Friday, we see the fact that Jesus is our suffering king, pulling together all these themes from the Old Testament that the Jews missed, Isaiah 53 in particular. Easter Sunday, rising victorious over sin, over death, over hell, over Satan himself. The point that we saw last week is that the risen Christ is worthy of your everything. Why? Because he's the victorious, conquering king. So this morning, I want you to see in this text, again, this idea of kingship and authority. Jesus is our universal king, not just our universal king, but the universal king over all things, over all creation, over all people, nations, tribes, languages. He is the universal king. And everyone, everywhere is called to submit to this king. So, what I want you to see from this text this morning as we make our way in, especially kind of looking at, again, these last 5 verses, is this, that hope for all humanity is only found in Jesus Christ. Hope for all humanity is only found in Jesus Christ. What I mean by hope is this idea of true, lasting, satisfying hope. Lasting, eternal, soul-satisfying hope, not just for you, not just for me, but for everyone on the face of the planet, is only found in Jesus Christ. Again, this idea of him being the universal king. We'll see, and if you watch the video for worship, you heard the text from Daniel 7 read. It's a very fitting text that's alluded to in this morning's text. But the reality of Christ being our only hope, we see all over the Bible. We see it in Acts chapter 4, for instance. Acts chapter 4, verse 12 says, "There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved." So you can break that down clause by clause, and we could spend weeks just unpacking that statement alone from Acts chapter 4. But that's where hope is only found in him. And what I mean by hope, it's probably important to define. We use that word a lot. And for many of us, it means different things. What I mean by hope is unwavering confidence in God and in his workings on our behalf. So God is working all things together for our good. I trust that you believe that you hope in that you see that as a reality. Romans 8:28 points to that fact. That God is working all things together for our good and for his glory, for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. God is working. And so to see beneath the surface of our life's circumstances, again, things that we would never script for ourselves, paths that we would never choose on our own to walk down. And yet beneath all of that, to see that God is stirring, God is moving, and God is working. That's what gives us hope. And again, so important for us to realize that sometimes, I would go so far as to say most of the times, it doesn't mean that our circumstances change. That coming to faith and trusting in God and hoping in the gospel doesn't necessarily mean that by default, all of our circumstances change. It simply means we have hope in the midst of them, that God meets us in the midst of them, in the midst of our deepest, darkest moments of life, and walks with us, alongside of us, never to leave us, never to forsake us. And that's what the gospel brings for us. So as we talk about this idea of hope announced, if this is true in our lives, it means it can't stay with us. We can't just put it on a shelf right up here behind me and look at it occasionally, glance at it, maybe dust it off occasionally. No, it means that it must impact and influence everything about our lives. It must make its way from our mind into our heart, out of our mouths to those around us. That's what we see in this morning's text. So we've seen a couple of these things, that Jesus has authority over all things. And we've only spent time in Matthew, basically Matthew 21 all the way to 28, kind of jumping over most of the middle of that as we made our way into this series. But if you survey the book of Matthew, one of the things that Matthew does, again, is point to the kingship of Christ and his authority over all things, over nature itself in chapter 8, over disease and demons, over sin, of him being the one that's able to forgive sin. Only God is able to forgive sin. So it points again to this reality that of these claims that Christ makes on behalf of representing God himself, of being God himself. Over death itself, we saw last Sunday, as he walks out of the grave. And as we see in different parts of chapter 16, parts of chapter 25. Jesus has authority over all of humanity. And this is a stark reality for us this morning as we think about our neighbors, as we think about those around us in our world that want nothing to do with God, nothing to do with Christ. The reality is that one day they will bow a knee. The Bible's clear about this, that every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is who he says he is. That they will surrender their lives, submit themselves to him. Some of that means that right now, on this side of judgment, we can do that freely. We can do that willingly. But the moment is coming when it will be too late. But the knee will still bow. Jesus is the conquering king, the universal king. And so I want you to see as we look into Matthew 28, 16 to 20, that reality. So the first thing I want you to see, we'll look at verses 16 to 18, is that the authority is Christ's. Look at verses 16 to 18. Again, very familiar text, Matthew 28. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So he's said many times, I'm going to go ahead of you and meet you in Galilee. We saw that even last week in chapter 28. After I'm raised up, I'm going to go before you to Galilee. The angel tells him, go to the women, go get the disciples, meet Jesus in Galilee. Jesus meets the women and says, go find my brothers. I'll meet you. I'm going ahead of you to Galilee. First reference in Matthew's gospel is Matthew chapter 4. And Galilee there is called Galilee of the Gentiles. And it's interesting, it's a reference back to Isaiah chapter 9. Again, the designation there, we miss in our modern readings or listening to this. This is a pagan city. It's a city of the Gentiles. And Jesus tells the disciples from the outset, after I'm raised, I'm going to meet you there in Galilee of the Gentiles. So this idea of salvation coming from the Jews, I'm going to meet you in this city, Galilee of the Gentiles, and from there, I'm going to send you to every place on planet Earth. So meet me there. That's where it all begins. So they come, they meet him there, and it says when they saw him, they worshiped him. So same response as the women. The women is kind of this mixture of fear and worship. And so again, to worship simply means to ascribe value to something. And every moment of your life, your heart is constantly looking for things to gravitate toward, to ascribe value to. I don't have to convince you of this. Our hearts, John Calvin says, are perpetual idol factories. This idea that over and over and over, we're constantly looking for something to place our hope and our faith and our confidence in. And so here they worship Christ. So they ascribe value. They see the risen Christ. And yet the text tells us, but some doubted. And I'll be honest with you, I think Thomas usually gets a bad rap of, I'm not going to believe until I can see and I can touch these wounds. And the reality is, the way that this is worded, this puzzlement and this fearful anticipation, this lack of confidence and assurance is true of all of us, not just Thomas. So there's a big way to interpret this text, and a lot of disagreement between commentators of what is this text actually saying? Is this partial or is this inclusive? Is he saying some of the disciples doubted or all of them? All were uncertain. And I think it points us to the reality of this tension in the Christian life of I believe, yet help my unbelief. I worship and I want to follow, and yet there are things that don't make sense to me. And that's where the disciples are at in this moment. But some of them doubted. They're wondering, what is this real? Much like the women going to the tomb on that first Easter morning of, wait, Is everything that we're walking through real? Is this a bad dream? And so all of these words that have been communicated, all of these stories, all of these days together, is this true? And so they're wondering, what next? What now? What are we supposed to do? What does this all mean? And so the reality is, I think all of them, to a certain degree or another, are doubting what are the full implications of this? That Jesus did rise from the dead, as he said. So there's a constant mixture, I think, in the Christian life of worship and fear, of worship and doubt, of balancing all of this. You know, we live by faith alone. That's simply it. We have a book that tells us this amazing story, and eyewitness testimony that points to that, and creation itself that's crying out and declaring the glory of God. But that's what faith is. Faith is the assurance of things not seen and hoping for what we long to be true. And that's the beauty of the gospel for us, is it meets us in the midst of that and says, here's the ultimate reality of your life, and answers those questions for us. But there's a constant mixture for us in our Christian lives of this reality of trust and uncertainty. So one of the commentators that I read, Michael Wilkins, says they're not met by gullible enthusiasm, but by logical hesitancy until they're convinced by the facts, until they're convinced by the facts. And the truth is, if we're honest, that's true of you and I as well. That we're not called to just blind, gullible faith. No, it's prove this to be true. Step out and in full faith and full dependence on all that God has called us to do, based again upon objective reality, that for these men and for these women, they're seeing with their own eyes. That's why last week we saw this theme of behold, see, touch, tell, because it's true. And they can touch and feel and taste and smell with their own eyes, with their own mouths, their own ears, their own senses. And that's why we have such confidence in the Word of God on this testimony. But Jesus calls them to himself. And as you know from the gospel and from the Bible, from the Gospels and the Bible, Jesus has nothing. Nothing. He's poor. His parents, when they first go to the temple, offer 2 turtle doves, right? Two seemingly insignificant birds because of their poverty level. That's all they could afford, right? As he's calling men and women to himself, he says, look, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So he lives in poverty, has nothing, or so it seems. So it seems. Again, he says here, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Last week, when we talked about Jesus being raised from the dead, it's a divine passive, meaning that the subject of the raising is God himself. This text does the very same thing. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. You have to ask the question, by whom? Who gave Jesus all of this authority? All the authority on heaven and on earth, all authority over all things in all of creation. Again, it's a divine passive. The subject there is God. But rather than just reading things into the text, listen to Daniel 7, 13 to 14. Daniel 7, I think 9 to 14 was read during worship. But listen to the image, this vision that Daniel has from Daniel chapter 7. Verses 9 to 12 is all this picture of the Ancient of Days, of God himself sitting on his glorious throne. And then comes verses 13 and 14. With the clouds of heaven came one like the Son of Man. He came to the Ancient of Days, was presented before him, and to him was given all dominion, all glory, a kingdom that peoples, all nations, all languages should serve him. His will be an everlasting dominion. It shall not pass away. His kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed. So this picture of God sitting on the throne and one like a Son of Man coming before him. It's interesting in the Gospels. Jesus' favorite self-designation is not the Son of God, is not Emmanuel, is not any of these other things. It's the Son of Man. When the Son of Man comes, the Son of Man did not come all of these times over and over and over, meaning not just that I'm born of man and woman, that uh, Joseph is my earthly father and Mary is my earthly mother, and so I'm a son of man. No, he's alluding to this text here in Daniel chapter 7, that there's this moment where God sitting on his throne is met by the Son of Man and given all authority over all of creation, all dominion and glory in a kingdom that all peoples and all nations and all languages should serve him. And the reality is, it's a dominion and a kingdom and a rule and a reign that never ends. It will never be destroyed. It shall never pass away. So when Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth is mine, it's been given to me. It's this picture from Daniel chapter 7, that all authority has been given to him by God at the resurrection. Now to say, you are the reigning, conquering, victorious, universal king over all of creation. It's an amazing thing that on the surface, it seems like Jesus has nothing to offer these men, these women, these disciples, nor us. So come, I've got nothing to give you. No, instead it's come. Everything in all of creation is mine. So the authority is Christ's. The authority is Christ's. Secondly, I want you to see that the activity is ours. The activity is ours. As we make our way into verses 19 and the first half of verse 20. So listen to these verses. So because of that, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. Again, very familiar text. Many of you can quote this. Many of you know this text. It's the first text I preached. My installation service was on this text of what as a church are we called to do? What are we called to be about? Very fun to reflect on those days in the past year plus of here and shepherding and serving here. So it's fun to be back in this text. But again, don't let the familiarity of this text lead to complacency. Free to tune out and grab the phone and check on something else, or think about lunch plans or what you're going to do this afternoon on this beautiful day. No, listen afresh to these words. Again, the authority is his. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. It's mine. And yet the very next words tell us that the activity of all disciples is this reality. Embedded in this text from chapter or verse 19 to 20, there are 2 commands and 3 participles. Welcome back to English class. So 2 commands and 3 participles. Again, participles are ing words. So it tells us how to do the commands. So the participles then, by default of being combined with a command, take on the force of a command as well. And so the first command that we meet here in verse 19 is not go. We tend to think, and we read this, and so much has been done in this text to show drop everything, sell everything, put everything in storage and go. And there's a definite call to that, and we'll look at that in a minute. But the first command is not to go. The first command here is to make disciples. Make disciples. The call of disciple making is that when we make a disciple, they're not a disciple until they've made a disciple themselves. And so this is a huge aspect of the Western Christian church that I think we've dropped the ball on. So the call for us to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. We've not made a disciple until they have actively stepped out and made a disciple themselves. This is a self-duplicating, replicating pattern that Jesus instilled in those first 11 apostles, the disciples, when he says to them, as I've done to you, now you go and do to others, and replicate this pattern of discipleship over and over and over. To be a disciple is to become a disciple, to further grow in your own discipleship of all that the gospel compels you toward. But it also means that we have to make disciples. We have to make disciples. There's an immense call to obedience here. And if we're honest, something that we're probably a little uncomfortable with, because we tend to relegate this to pastors, to elders, to Sunday school teachers, to missionaries, the people that are really serious about this Christian thing, this Christian life. This is their call. Again, remember the makeup of the first 12 disciples. Judas ends up taking his own life, but it's a hodgepodge. This group of misfits, of fishermen and zealots and former tax collectors, and he entrusts to them the greatest news ever to come into human history, of sins being forgiven, of this kingdom being established, and says, the way I want you to perpetuate this is with your life. Let the words that come out of your mouth and the activity that comes out of your heart day by day over the long haul of your life around others, to impress upon them the simplicity of this message. So again, it's this idea is, as I've done for you, now go do for others. The aim in discipleship is not simply conversion. And this is where I think the Western church has missed it. We're all about church growth strategies and metrics and measures. So if we get this many people to convert, look, this is a win. And yet one of the profound things in the Gospels is all of that's thrown on its head. In John chapter 6, this great crowd of disciples is following him, and they're just wanting. Again, we see this with the idea of the crowd. What can we get? And they simply say, feed us. Jesus says, okay, well, then how about eat my flesh and drink my blood? And a lot of them go, no, that's not what we had in mind. And John 6 tells us a great number of his disciples walked away. So Jesus isn't interested in numbers. He's not interested simply in conversion. He's interested in discipleship over the long haul, in the life of his own disciples and their obedience to the gospel. So interestingly enough, this text, probably in your own Bible, above verse 16, has a heading that says something like the Great Commission. In modern Western church, it's usually referred to now as the Great Omission, because we don't really do this. Because again, we have this mindset that that's for somebody else. And again, the gravity of this text on our lives is not to go, it's to make disciples. And so the call of obedience on your own heart and on your own life as a disciple means that you're not a disciple if you're not making disciples. So my question is, who in your life are you pursuing to disciple with the gospel? Not just sports and menus and our hobbies. We're really good about surrounding ourselves with those kinds of pockets of similarity. Are you leveraging those relationships for the sake of discipleship, for the sake of the gospel? That's what this text calls us to. That's what this great commission presses us toward. But again, it's all rooted in the authority of Christ. All authority. It's amazing to me that the gravity and the weight of these verses is sandwiched between all authority in heaven and on earth is mine, and the closing statement that we'll look at, behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And sandwiched between these two glorious statements is this call to make disciples. So Acts 14, verse 21 says they went into the city and preached the gospel and made many disciples. The NIV actually uses the phrase, they won many disciples. This idea of winning people over to faith, of leveraging and stewarding your life that is a gift from God in every situation that you face, every pocket of influence that you have. Parents, it means for you during these days, it's with your kids. It's your spouse. It's coworkers and your boss and those that you oversee, the people on your cul-de-sac that live across the street from you, the people that drive you nuts, all of them. All authority, Jesus says, in heaven and on earth is mine. Go and make disciples of all nations. But again, the go is not the command. It really should be read as, while going, make disciples. While you're going about your daily rhythms and daily patterns and daily routines, right? So your own zip code, your own, you think of a course of a normal week, and I don't mean this past month, normal week. Right, you get up, you see the same people in your home. You go to Caribou and you get coffee. You pass the same people at a gas station. You go to the same place to drop off your dry cleaning. You go to your office. You have lunch with the same people at the same restaurant. All of those people, you have the incredible privilege of shepherding with your life for the sake of the gospel. None of those are by chance. So this is the implication of this go. While you're going about your daily rhythms and daily patterns and daily life, make disciples. So for some, it will mean drop everything, sell everything that you have, and get on a plane and go. But for most of us, this is why you're going about where God has planted your feet, where your mailbox is and your street address is. That's for a reason. So leverage it for the sake of the gospel. But again, like I said, this does mean to the ends of the earth. In Matthew 24:14, if you flip back just a couple of pages, a couple of chapters, it's a profound statement there. In Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the end coming. And in verse 14, he says this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. You've probably heard many times that the past couple of generations for sure, that we could fulfill the Great Commission in our lifetime. There are 11,000 people groups on planet Earth right now, 11,000 people groups. We're not talking about nations, but individual tribes, about 11,000. As of this year, there are roughly 6,000, just over 6,000 that are unreached, have never had a gospel influence come in. And so while this text is talking about going about the normal rhythms of your life, the call here as well is among all nations. And so it's profound that in Matthew 24, Jesus says the gospel will be preached to all nations, and then the end will come. This is one of the contingencies on the return of Christ, that the gospel goes forth to every nation, every tribe, every people group. And so it may mean that you go. But again, this is where the gravity of this text is sandwiched between these amazing statements of all authority in verse 18, and I'm with you always in verse 20. That frees us. Please hear this. This is not a call to white knuckle. You can try harder and go do this to prove your love for Christ. No. Listen to how this text comes. All authority in heaven and on earth belongs to Christ. And he is with us, even to the end of the age, as the author and finisher of our faith. And right between those is this call. Hey, let your life be a testimony of the gospel by doing these things. So all authority is his, and the comfort of knowing that he's never going to walk away from it. Everything that's happening is under his authority. So you can go anywhere on planet Earth, anywhere in the cosmos, and there's nowhere that you will reach that doesn't belong to him. It's a profound comfort when we talk about the call and the gravity of this text. But then there are two other participles, baptizing and teaching. So baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. It's amazing to me that Jesus is telling them, hey, when you make a disciple, baptize them, and baptize them not just in the name of the Father and the Holy Spirit, but me as well. This authority that he's been given, he's now exercising in how he even communicates about baptism. I want you to see again, baptism is a matter of obedience. So it's interesting. Here's one of the clearest cases for believers' baptism. Make disciples, baptize them. So baptism comes after your conversion. So I would press you. I know there are some of you that are listening that have yet to be baptized as a believer post-conversion, and I would press you to wrestle with that. Again, it's a matter of obedience. We don't gain anything from God. He doesn't credit us with righteousness because we are baptized. There's nothing magical about those waters. I was baptized in a dunk tank in the back of a chapel at Ramstein Air Force Base in 1997. Thankfully, it wasn't with someone throwing a ball. It was just what we had available. There was no baptistry in the church. There's nothing magical about that water. It is a public declaration to all those around of what God has done in you, of this new life that he has breathed into you, this heart of stone taken out and a heart of flesh put in. So hopefully in July, we'll see. Last year we did baptism and burgers. I'm going to kind of hope to do that again. And so I would encourage you, if you've yet to be baptized, for you to process this, pray through this, wrestle with this idea, talk to me, talk to one of our elders. This is a big deal because the first thing that he says after make disciples is baptize them. Spend your life then after this teaching them. So baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. So again, there's a lot tied into this verb, and it means that it's both formal and informal. It's life on life. It's day by day. It's over the course of your life in every circumstance, in every situation. Right? He doesn't just say teach them to observe, or he doesn't say teach them all that I've told you. Right? Teach them how to just hear what I've said. No, teach them to observe. Teach them what it looks like to be obedient. Teach them what it looks like to follow well. Teach them what it looks like to parent as a parent with the gospel. Teach them what it looks like to love your wife the way Christ loved the church. Teach them what it looks like. Teaching them to observe takes some time. Teaching them to observe takes some intentionality. Teaching them to observe means opening up your life to others. That we have to push past some of the Instagram filters and the Pinterest perfect kind of table settings and food, and just to say, come in. My life is a mess. And I need you to see that in the midst of this mess, God is glorious. Yes, I love Instagram. I love photography, but you never see, maybe I'll make that an aim over the next week. You never see piles of laundry that people are posting. You never see, like, there's this beautiful dinner that we've created. And if you pan just to the right, there's like 7 weeks worth of dishes. No, we're really good about framing what we want people to see. And yet this idea of teaching them to observe means that it comes with brokenness. It comes outside of that frame. It comes with the pain of just life, of the stresses of these days, of just being a bum and dropping the ball and blowing it in front of your kids and in front of your spouse, and for people to see what forgiveness looks like and repentance looks like and mercy looks like. That's not easy. But again, we're not called to what's easy. We are not called to what's easy. We're called to what's faithful, because in the midst of those moments is where God meets us. Always struck by that. When Paul says, I had this thorn in my flesh, this messenger of Satan, and 3 times I pleaded with God to take it, and he didn't. And instead says, my grace is sufficient for you because my power is made perfect not in your strength, but in your weakness. So teaching them to observe means in the midst of your brokenness, in the midst of your sin, in the midst of your depravity, in the midst of all the highs and lows of your life. So welcome people in to that mess. Let them see the goodness of God and the glory of the gospel in spite of you, not because of you, but because of God's grace in the midst of it. But the call in the midst of this all is the gospel. I was just cleaning up some of the basement the other day and ran across a book that I didn't even know I had. And it was this book on Matthew's gospel written by Charles Spurgeon. The very last page, I just happened to kind of say, I wonder if he speaks to this text. And the very last page in the book, Charles Spurgeon makes this point: we are not to invent anything new, nor to change anything to suit the current of the age, but to teach baptized believers to observe all things whatsoever our divine King has commanded. That's the call for us in the midst of this, teaching them to observe, not us, but the gospel through us, to show all that God is. This is where, again, it's not just about sports and food and knitting and cross stitch, but the gospel. So leverage all of those things for the sake of the gospel while going about your life. Make disciples. Leave the fruitfulness up to God. We are called not to be fruitful, but to be faithful. We get concerned over and over and over with the metrics. What's the result? What's the outcome? Leave it to God. You just be faithful with your life to do what this text calls you to do, and God will bring about the fruit. I promise you. I promise you. But this is a call for all of us. Not just me, not just our elders, not just missionaries. Every single one of you is either being obedient in this or disobedient in this. Because to be a disciple means that you are further becoming a disciple, and it means that you are making disciples. So who are you discipling? Lastly, so we've seen that the authority is Christ's. We've seen that the activity is ours. And then lastly, I want you to see that the achievement is his. The achievement is his. So look at the second half of verse 20. I've alluded to it. Behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. So this is where the second command is. So first command, make disciples. How? Going, baptizing, teaching. Then now comes the second command. Did you see it? Behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. I've read this text hundreds of times, but it wasn't until about a year ago when I was preparing for this text that I never saw there's a command there. Behold. Behold. We saw this last week over and over and over in the first half of Matthew 28. 40 times in the Gospel of Matthew, he uses that word. Behold. It means to be captivated by something, to be struck by and stirred in the deepest recesses of your heart. Be captivated, he's saying. Jesus is saying, behold, I am with you. I am with you always. Why? Remember Matthew 1, verse 23? One of the first titles that Jesus receives in this book. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. So from the outset, this has been the promise of God dwelling among us, taking up flesh and residing among us. So that's what the incarnation is, God moving to town. And that's what we see here. Jesus is alluding to that very fact here. I am with you always. And the reality is it's for all of eternity. He was and is and always will be their king. He was and is and always will be our king. Now, something doesn't become true just because you believe it. It becomes reality for you, but there are things that are true regardless of whether you believe it or not. And this is one of those statements. Jesus was and is and will always be the universal king of all of creation, whether or not we acknowledge it and whether or not we like it or not. It points here to the eternality of the Son. Remember, in Revelation, it makes this declaration that before the foundation of the world, the Lamb was slain. Again, the achievement is his. The call for us is to keep our eyes fixed on him. It means, again, to behold with new wonder this morning. Don't let the familiarity of this text go, yeah, I get it. No. Look at him afresh. Be captivated by him afresh. This is the fuel that you need to accomplish what verses 19 and the first half of verse 20 call us to. While going about your life, making disciples, baptizing them, teaching them to observe all that he's commanded, the only way to potentially and possibly do that is to know that the authority is his, and ultimately the achievement and the working out of this is his, as we just keep our eyes fixed on him. John 16, verse 33, Jesus says, I've said these things to you that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have trouble or tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. In other words, you don't have to try to take over the world. You don't have to try to overcome the world. I've done that. Now just take hope and confidence and rest in me. Jesus' authority doesn't simply end, nor does his working on our behalf once he ascends to the right hand of the Father. No, absolutely not. I am with you always. He is present and active in countless things. As I was thinking about this, I just jotted down 8. There's literally hundreds. We could spend entire sermon series looking at this reality that Jesus is present and active in the daily life of the believer. Right now in your life, Jesus is present and active. He's not given up on you. He's not abandoned you. He is working right now in your life if you are a believer. Jesus is present and active in the building of his church. Amazing that he uses these means. In these simple men and women at the very outset of Christianity to bring about this news to the ends of the earth. And Jesus makes that promise that I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Jesus is present and active in building his church. Jesus is present and active in interceding for us before the Father. So he's seated at the right hand. And the New Testament goes on to tell us that he daily lives to intercede for us. To intercede means to stand in the gap, means to pray, but also when we blow it again and again and again, we continue to sin. No. He's my child. I've paid for that sin. I've paid that debt. He daily lives to intercede for us. He is present and active in that right now. Jesus is present and active in the word being preached. And there's something profound about this word being preached, opening it up and says, thus says the Lord. Isaiah 55 talks about as the rain goes forth and the snow waters the ground and it produces a crop, which produces a seed, which produces food. So shall my word be that will not return to me void. It's going to go out and accomplish what God has purposed for it. Even in these moments, let the word pierce your heart. Jesus is right now present and active in the preaching of his word. Jesus is present and active in the ministries that you are involved in, the things that you wake up longing to accomplish for the kingdom, the ministries that when we are normally functioning in a building and with things happening, Jesus is working in the midst of those, again, for the sake of his kingdom, for the sake of his glory, for the good of his people. He's working through those ministries. He's present and active. Jesus is present and active in going before you in mission for the sake of the gospel. So think about that. Every conversation you have with an unbeliever, to say, God, I want to have this conversation with this person. Stir in their heart, in their soul, in their spirit, so that as I speak, it becomes effective. God is working. Jesus is present and active and going before you in mission for the sake of the gospel, whether that's across the street or across the globe. So that changes how we do ministry, of begging God to move before we start planting seed, that he's tilling up the soil of that person's heart. Jesus is present and active in sustaining your faith and your walk. Love the New Testament says, he who began a good work in you will be faithful to bring it to completion. So day by day, the highs, the lows, the tears, the joys, the struggles, the pain, every single millisecond of your life, Jesus is sustaining you by his grace and by his power, because all authority is his, and he will never leave you, never forsake you, never abandon you. Jesus is present and active in your life. Jesus is present and active and working all things together for his glory and our good. So that, again, changes our perspective of even days like this. Again, to have an eternal perspective, to say, God, use these moments to affect in me a heart that worships you more, affect in me a desire to give more of my life to you. That we would say, I don't want these days. I don't like these days. I don't enjoy these days. And yet, God, leverage them for the sake of your glory and for my good. Jesus is present and active right now. That's what this concluding section of verse 20 is all about. Behold. So have eyes to see and be captivated by the reality that Jesus is working now on your behalf. It's not seated at the right hand of the Father, feet up, the work is done. No, he is active in the sake of all these things and hundreds of other ways that we didn't even discuss. I am with you always to the end of the age. I am with you. So the call for us is to depend on him and obey him. So concluding text for us would just be Hebrews 12, verse 2. Look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So the call for us is to do that. So a couple of questions as we finish is, what stands in the way of you beholding him this morning? What do you go, this is too big of a deal. I can't keep my eyes off of this to focus on him, to behold him. What is it for you this morning? Because when you behold him, then this call, the commands here and the how we do that in verses 18 and 19 become a joy to us, to make disciples while going about our lives and baptizing and teaching them. Like, this becomes a joy for us to behold him, to trust him, to rest in him. Again, with all of this, with the aim of announcing him, that hope is announced by us, that God uses us, like he used these, again, this band of misfits, in these first 11 disciples. And yet God uses us to accomplish the very same things as these sharers of news, to declare his hope among all peoples, starting in your own living room, all the way across the seas to Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia. It doesn't matter where. So leverage your life. Announce the hope that he has planted in you. And if there's something standing in your way of obedience, bring that to God and ask him to continue to work and change your heart, to make you obedient, to behold him afresh this morning and be captivated by the work that he's accomplished for you. Again, because ultimately the true, lasting, eternal, soul satisfying hope is only found in Jesus Christ. And that's for you and every person on planet Earth, because Jesus alone is our universal King.